Hey y'all, howdy. Welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell, and in the last 2 months, I binged 7 Silvia Moreno-Garcia books because I had major FOMO. I hear so many people on BookTube talk about her books, and so many of them have sounded great to me. I mark books on Goodreads as like want to read, and it took me like a long time to realize that a lot of the books that I had marked were all from the same author. And so that's what gave me this idea, was like, oh, I finally need to read this author because clearly so many of her books have a ton of appeal to me. So today I'm going to be talking about all 7 of the books, what I thought of them, and tier ranking them. For the tiers that I am making this tier ranking with, I chose song titles from the Velvet Was the Night playlist that Silvia Moreno-Garcia made. She shared this at the end of the book, and I looked it up on Spotify. It is a banger of a playlist, so I thought this would be a fun way to create the tiers for these different books that I read. Tier 1, we have Bang Bang, because these books were bangers. Tier 2, Can't Help Falling in Love. Tier 3, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow? These I would consider more in the like fun but kind of forgettable category. And then Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, these books just were not for me. And No me platiques más, I think is how you say that. It means don't talk to me anymore. Those are the 5 tiers for the books that I've created. Let's talk about them. So I have these on here in order of publication date. So Certain Dark Things came out in 2016, and Silver Nitrate is her most recent book that came out this year. So she currently has 9 full-length novels that she has published, and I've read all but 2 of them. Starting with Certain Dark Things. Certain Dark Things is a vampire, like urban fantasy novel. It's set in Mexico City. And one of the things that I thought was really unique and cool about this was that there are different types of vampires. They're different subspecies. One of the main characters in this book is a subspecies that is known in Aztec mythology, and they're more bird-like. They can sprout wings, they have talons, but there's, you know, the more traditional vampires that we think of as like the European type vampires, and there's lots, I think there's like 12 different types of vampires in this story. The main character in this one are the ones that are native to Mexico. This is like an alternate Mexico City, an alternate history type thing where humans know that vampires are real and that they exist, and there's lots of prejudice against them, obviously, because they feed on humans. Many countries have created laws and kicked out vampires entirely. Vampires are not allowed in Mexico City. A lot of the vampire clans that exist in Mexico have become sort of cartels. They're really insular clans, and they're territorial, and they control the drug trade. This story is about a vampire whose family was slaughtered by another vampire cartel, and she escapes to Mexico City, and totally alone, she's outcast, and she meets a young man who lives on the streets, and it's about their relationship and her trying to escape Mexico entirely and go somewhere where she thinks she'll be safe. This was so fun and cool. I had absolutely the best time with this book. I read it in a single day, which I think is the only book of hers that I did in a single day, but I was just so immersed. I felt absolutely like I was living in the world. It was sexy and cool and mysterious, and the world building was just top notch. So Certain Dark Things is absolutely bang bang. Next up, The Beautiful Ones is a historical romance of sorts. It has a little bit of magical realism. I think it's considered like a fantasy book. It sort of has that Pride and Prejudice kind of feel. It's very prim and proper high society. It is about a woman who is from the country, and she's sent to the city to be with her cousin for her debut in society for the season. Her cousin thinks she's a country bumpkin. She doesn't like her at all. But her first season, she meets a man who she's absolutely is enamored with right away. And he has the same sort of magical ability that she does, which is sort of like a telekinesis. They can move things with their minds. And she doesn't really know how to control her power very well, but he does. And so not only is she like enamored with him in that he's like a charming, handsome young man, but also she wants him to teach her how to use her powers better. And he pretends to be very interested in her, but he actually is in love with her cousin. And so he's using her to get close to her cousin because they had a fling like 10 years ago. So that's the basic premise of this one. I think for me, it was a super fun read and it read very quickly, but romance just isn't necessarily my thing as much as other, and I was really looking forward to the magical realism, kind of the fantasy elements of this book, and they were really underplayed. So it didn't live up to my hope for it, in that I think if there had been more of the magic included as part of the story, if they had focused more on like the training sort of things that were going on and less on kind of the drama, then I think that would have been more fun for me. Also, I felt like it builds and builds and builds the romance. There's, the ups and downs of everything that goes on in the book. But then sort of like the happy ending, I felt like was also just like too short for like an entire book to build up to. It was just like over really quickly as far as like the happily ever after part. So I wish I could have had a little more of that and a lot more of the fantastical elements. But I really enjoyed it and I had a good time the entire time I was reading it. I'm going to put this in Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow? Not because I don't think the romance was lasting, but just because as much as I enjoyed this book while I was reading it, I don't know that it was super memorable or will have much of a lasting impact on me. Next up is The Gods of Jade and Shadow. This is a fantasy story. It is set in the 1920s and it is completely based on Mayan mythology. There are gods of death, there are demons, there's a trip to the underworld, and the main character in this one is like a Cinderella-esque figure who is mistreated by her family and she just dreams of a different life for herself with adventure. And when she stumbles upon that adventure and is swept away from her home, she is in for a lot more than she bargained for. This had all of the fairy tale vibes. It was magical, it was cool, it was a little melancholy and hopeful at the same time. So I had a great time with this one. I didn't love it quite as much as Certain Dark Things, but it was definitely bang bang. Next up, Mexican Gothic. This is by far Silvia Moreno-Garcia's most well-read and most well-known novel. This is a horror, like a historical horror novel. This one is about a young woman. She's like a socialite. She's very kind of a spoiled young woman who doesn't really want to take her life too seriously yet. And she gets a letter from her cousin that's very disturbing. Her cousin married a man and moved away to his family's estate, and they've really not heard from her since. And then she gets a letter from her cousin that just is utterly deranged, and her cousin is clearly calling for help of some kind, but it sounds like she's just descended into madness and they're not really sure how this could possibly be. She's only been gone for a year and she was a normal young woman when she left. So the main character goes and stays with her cousin at her cousin's husband's family estate. The house is very creepy. It definitely gives you like all of the dark Gothic vibes. There's weird mold and mildew growing around the house. The family is very strange. They don't like to talk to each other. She's getting like a weird aggressive vibes from her cousin's husband, and she's just not really sure what's going on. It all feels a little bit like a fever dream, and she does start having these very odd dreams. It spirals and spirals into a dark madness by the end of it. I thought this was really great in the last 2/3 of the book. The first 1/3 of the book I thought was honestly pretty boring and slow. And that was a disappointment because I think this had the potential to be bang bang. But in the end, I'm gonna put it in Can't Help Falling in Love, just because even though my reading experience wasn't fantastic the entire time, this story was just absolutely haunting and uncomfortable at times. I was very unsettled, and just the dynamics between her and the family, especially her and her cousin's husband, was just, it was honestly like, it just gave me the ick, which I think was exactly what Silvia Moreno-Garcia was trying to do. So absolutely, this book will stick with me for a long time. And it was really just the first 1/3 of the book that I didn't vibe with too well. Next up, we have Velvet Was the Night. This is a story that was set in early 1970s Mexico, and it is about a group that was sanctioned by the Mexican government and helped trained by the American CIA, whose goal was to infiltrate student groups on college campuses that were leftist and to break them up and start riots and inform on them to the government. So a very horrific time in Mexican history, and it has a very noir feel. There's some morally gray characters for sure. I was super intrigued the entire time I was reading this book. It was really, really good, and I felt like I learned a lot from it too. Honestly, the only thing I didn't enjoy about this book was one of the protagonists just had such cripplingly low self-esteem. She considered herself a very boring person. She had a secretarial job at a law firm that she doesn't like, and she like steals things from people's houses like for fun, and she reads like romance comic books that sound very like soap opera-esque, and she listens to records, and like that's her whole life. So she considers herself very boring, and she just like doesn't have a good body image, and so like any time that her appearance is mentioned, she just talks about how awful she looks and how she feels about her body, and I just hated that. I know that is how a lot of women feel about their bodies, but it just made it an unpleasant reading experience for me because I just couldn't vibe with her. I just wanted her to lighten up and to like get a grip and to focus on, you know, bigger things. The plot of the story is about her. She agrees to cat sit for her neighbor that lives across the hall from her while her neighbor goes off for the weekend, and then her neighbor disappears while she's off on vacation or off for the weekend, and she finds out that this neighbor was involved in these student protests. The Hawks broke up, and that she might have some incriminating photographs of government officials. She gets wrapped up in this sort of revolution era things that are going on, trying to find out what happened to her neighbor. The other main character perspective that we get is a young man who is a hawk. He's one of these people that works for this kind of secret branch of the government whose job is to basically rough up students and leftists and make sure that they like don't get any power in society. His perspective I found super duper fascinating. But again, I just didn't vibe very well with the other main character. So I absolutely did fall in love with the story, can't help falling in love. But because Silvia Moreno-Garcia's characters are so vivid, if you don't vibe with one, it really can, I think, throw off the momentum of the book. And that's how I felt with this one. But absolutely would highly recommend Velvet Was the Night. Next up, we have The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. So now we're getting into her super recent books. Daughter of Dr. Moreau just came out last year in 2022. And this one was smoke gets in your eyes for me. I really wanted to like it a lot. It is a historical sci-fi retelling of the island of Dr. Moreau, and it's set on the Yucatan Peninsula. I thought the way that she weaved in Mexican history and kind of the oppression of indigenous peoples during that time period was really interesting. But I think the appeal of the original island of Dr. Moreau is the questions of humanity at play with the monstrous animal-like humanoid creations that Dr. Moreau creates. And in this story, animal-humanoid hybrids exist, but she, the main character, considers them human just like herself. And so I feel like that strong moral question that's at play that H.G. Wells was trying to accomplish with the original story is really just not even a factor in the Silvia Moreno-Garcia rendition of it. So I didn't really appreciate that. I also just thought it was really slow. Again, the characters are super vivid and so is the world, but there just wasn't really any substance to it that I really latched onto. So it just wasn't for me. That was definitely a smoke gets in your eyes. And finally, we have Silver Nitrate. This one just came out in 2023, and this is a historical horror, I guess, that is set in the 1990s, and the main character is a film sound editor, which I absolutely loved that aspect of it. The main idea behind Silver Nitrate is this main character is obsessed with old horror films, and she ends up meeting the director of one of the films that she really liked when she was growing up. And he has this unfinished film that they started to make it. It was being directed by this Nazi occultist guy who believed in the magic of filmmaking and actually believed there was magic that could be done through the combination of film and sound when those were combined. So really interesting concept. And again, sort of like The Beautiful Ones, I feel very similar in that if there had been more focus on the fantastical and horror elements in this one, that the magical realism of it and the occult aspects, I think I would have had a better time. But so much of this book was focused on the relationship between the protagonist and the other protagonist, her friend. They were childhood friends, and they have complicated romantic feelings for each other. And it's really just a very toxic kind of codependent friendship where the man is basically just uses his friend. Whenever he goes through a breakup, he comes back and relies on her, and she does so much for him, and he just takes her for granted. And it seemed very just manipulative and unhealthy. And so much of the book was about their relationship. I felt like we were supposed to want them to work out their issues and get together in the end. And I just didn't. I didn't see why they would have been a good couple. And the fact that the book had so much focus on that instead of the cool horror Nazi occult film. Not that it wasn't about that, but again, I wish it had been more about that. Silvia Moreno-Garcia definitely has everything that you want when it comes to creating super vivid characters. These people and their relationship felt super real to me. And I did have a really, really good time reading this book. But again, like The Beautiful Ones, will you still love me tomorrow? It didn't make a huge impact on me, I guess is what I'm saying. So that's it. I didn't have No Me Platicas Mas, which is Don't Talk to Me Anymore. I thought all of her books were really just fun. Even The Daughter of Dr. Moreau was extremely well written and vivid. So my overall thoughts on Silvia Moreno-Garcia. One, I'm so glad that I finally no longer have FOMO about this author. I have read 7 of her 9 full-length novels, and I'm very glad that I finally dove in. Certain Dark Things, like I said, by far just a step above, I think, all of her other works, including Gods of Jade and Shadow. As much as I loved that one when I read Certain Dark Things, it was my entire world for the day that I read it. I forgot that the real world existed and I just lived in Certain Dark Things. I am incredibly impressed with Silvia Moreno-Garcia as an author. She, I think, has such a wide range. Anything from complete fantasy, paranormal, horror, historical. You can't put her in a box, and I love that about her because she can just write in any genre and she's just so talented and she can pull it off. Unlike, I think, a lot of authors who just stick to their lane. Silvia Moreno-Garcia has no lane. The world is her oyster, and she's fantastic. As far as will she be an auto-buy author in the future? Probably not, just because I had this pretty wide range of experiences with her books, but I will definitely be paying close attention anytime that I see she has a book coming out. And if the premise sounds good and other booktubers that I trust say good things about it, then chances are it's going to be on my TBR. Let me know down in the comments below what your favorite Silvia Moreno-Garcia book has been, or if you haven't read any of these yet, which one sounds the most intriguing to you. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below. I'll catch you next time.